Thank you, Program Manager. I have entitled my presentation, Family and Culture in Africa, Disjuncture and Continuity in South Africa. So it's a South African case. I start by asking a question. Where does one draw the boundaries between family and culture on the one side, and family and the existential realities on the other? In an attempt to answer this complex question, the paper examines the African family to explore tensions between existential circumstances brought about by the political economy of modernization in Africa, that's colonialism, Christianity, and industrialization, and the resilience of cultural variables which have sustained African populations for centuries on the other side. And I start by positioning the family in the African cultural context. The African value system is humanistic and relational, directed at interpersonal or intergroup relations, and not at some abstraction. And the family forms a cardinal pillar in this relationality. While conjugal relationships are important in marriage, Africans marry into families and not to start families. Because of this, the extended family was, and still to a certain extent, the norm. And I go to the second part where I deal with the African family in context. Now, a few observations are necessary to put the African family in perspective. First, the African continent has become very cosmopolitan since colonization, and despite both colonization and political decolonization as mediating factors, Africa follows the trajectory taken by families internationally, a move towards smaller nuclear families accompanied by an accent on individualism. Secondly, while economic development tends to favor the direction of nuclear families, the same forces act in a contradictory direction, compelling families to expand, but changing the compositional form with an accent on the collective. The locus and function of the African family in sub-Saharan Africa is mediated by a political economy which has attenuated the traditional cultural relevance of the family as the primary institution of socialization, a concept used to locate the family at the center of human relationality, the building block in the functioning of society. Yet, despite this, the tenacity of the cultural residual, those elements in the culture which are capable of withstanding the assaults of acculturation and enculturation. I use the terms assault in a particular context in South Africa. And in the case of the African family, the political economy of capitalist expansionism has kept the family and some of its traditional functions alive, notwithstanding the enormous challenges. Now, colonization had two aspects, the political and the cultural one. While at the political level, a number of battles were fought and conquests happened, at the cultural level, there were some attractive aspects of colonialism. The school, the hospital, the church, the shop, the automobile, etc., and those are the forces of modernization which were compelling and became part of the culture. I have divided the paper into two parts. The first part deals with the disjuncture, and the second with the continuity. Now let's come to the disjuncture. The economy of South Africa was primarily based on mining and industrialization. And the main source of that economy was cheap labor, which caused a lot of migration, forced migration. Forced migration had two parts. One, because the capitalists wanted cheap labor, but two, because there were contestations over the ownership of the country. To the extent that the capitalists wanted cheap labor, they recruited single men into the mining complexes. And this is as early as 1870 with the discovery of diamonds, 1886 with the discovery of gold. And the South African economy was completely predicated on these pillars. The mining units or the single-sex hostels to which men were recruited had ramifications. One, they took men far away from their homes into the mining centers. But with the recruitment of women as domestic labor, a second complexity arose. The men were contracted for a period of a year, and they would be away for 11 months of the year. Naturally, they found solace in the women that were there, and the sheikhs and other types of accommodation, since accommodation was only limited to the single-sex hostels for both. They then found accommodation in the sex, and sheikh settlements started sprouting around South African cities. They have been very difficult to eradicate to date. And that's part of the disjuncture. Now, the tables that I have provided explain the position. The first table is taken from the 2019 National Household Census. Now, South Africa has quite a sophisticated system of data collection. State South Africa is very active. We'll find that almost half of the families are described as as nuclear families, 43%. 36% of the total families are extended. And there is a very unique type called the skip generation families. The skip generation family comprises grandparents and children. Skip generation because the parents are away. That's part of it. The second table next to it provides the children living arrangements in South Africa. And you'll find that 19 or 20% of children lived with neither parent. It's not that they were living alone, but they lived with neither parent. 34%, about a third of the children in South Africa live with both mother and father. 41 or 42% live with mother only. And that's a very remarkable phenomenon because it literally typifies the existence of the migratory labor system up to now. Generally, it is the men who migrate most. Also, other research other than State South Africa stipulates the extent to which women at their prime childbearing age do that without necessarily a husband. So that about a third of women in their prime bearing age have children fathered by different men. And so we have quite a very high percentage of what is called the female-headed households. And that's all a function of the political economy. Now, what has that done in terms of the empirical findings? 3 observations come from that. The first is that marriage is not a central factor in the composition of the family, nor for that matter in the bearing and rearing of children. And it is not that marriage is debased in South African culture. The political economy has debased marriage. Secondly, the second observation relates to the extent to which political and economic forces, that's migrant labor, have mediated in the structure and composition of the African family. The third observation relates to the disintegration or dismemberment of the African family in South Africa. That has to be understood within the context of the national question. Who owns South Africa? Now let's come to the national question. Round about 1870, as I did say, 1880 to the 1890s, prior to that, Africa had been a largely an agrarian economy, and Africans had been integrated into the economy to the extent that they had developed a middle class, capitalist class. They had ox wagon that transported goods between towns and cities. They had developed an agriculture to the extent that in 1860, the first purely African-owned sugar mill was established at Glendon, near Stenger, near Durban in Natal. And there was a sprouting or sprawling African peasantry with lots of goods that were, and particularly feeding the markets in South Africa. And just by sheer legislation, this was all brought to an end because the white capitalist classes wanted migrant labor into the mines, and self-sufficient families were a barrier to this attainment. So that's the political economy side of it, or racial capitalism. Secondly, the migrant labor system lies at the heart of the family disintegration in South Africa, and to an extent in Southern Africa, because migrant labor did not only draw from what was called the reserves, those were the native homes or native areas in South Africa. It also drew from neighboring countries, Botswana, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, which was then Southern Rhodesia, and Mozambique. All those were fell under the same banner. Now let's come to the continuity. Has the family disappeared as a result of the dismemberment? No, it hasn't. The figures that we see, whether nuclear, extended, or living without parents, does not necessarily mean that the children are not in families. They are very much into families. Let's come to the African family as a whole. Political decolonization across Africa brought in attempts at cultural decolonization as well. While the former was relatively easy to accomplish, that's political decolonization, in terms of institutional arrangements and control over the organs of state, the latter has proven problematic and probably exists in name only. The traditional African family prior to the colonial onslaught was an equivalent of the Aristotelian oikos within the context of the prevalent culture and the limitations imposed by the economics and technological environment. Colonialism came with a technically advanced technology, an economic system that yielded immediate rewards, and a Christian education predicated on a religion that transcended culture and technology. While indigenous nations resented and indeed revolted against the political subjugation, the economic, cultural, and material artifacts of colonialism brought in immediate rewards, particularly in terms of the quality of life. The church, the school, and the hospital were undeniable beneficial institutions, and so was the shop, the factory, the ox wagon, and later the automobile. The impact of these colonial achievements on the culture of indigenous populations was enormous. Hence, acculturation and enculturation happened almost automatically. The undermining of the indigenous culture and value system was thus both deliberate and autonomous by association, as indigenous inhabitants attributed all the visible achievements to the colonial culture. Where does this place the family? While the political economy caused a disjuncture in family patterns, tenacity in the values, admittedly not at variance with some of the Western values, particularly Christianity, kept the family as oikos. Now, how has the family been kept as oikos? I give here a little case study of two men who shared the same family name, and sharing the same family name or the same surname in Africa means descent from the same person. So any Zulu is my brother or my sister, and I cannot marry a Zulu or a woman born of a Zulu. That's the first thing. Secondly, when Africans marry, as I did say, they marry into families. There is an acknowledgement of family relationships from both the husband and the wife's side, so that my mother-in-law automatically becomes my mother, and her tribulations are my tribulations. Similarly, my wife's mother-in-law, which is my mother, automatically becomes her mother, and her tribulations are my mother's tribulations are my wife's tribulations. For instance, in my own personal case, my wife had six sisters and 2 brothers. She's the eldest born. The father died in 1970, just immediately before we got married. All the siblings have been educated in my family, not because of kindness, but because it was expected of us to do so. If we didn't, we would have fallen from grace culturally. And that's how the family has been kept alive, by the tenacity of cultural variables. And the story of Charles and Paul that I narrate is literally a true story of how 2 people who shared the same family name automatically became brothers, not only emotionally, but also materially as well. Now, in conclusion, what do I say about the family? 1, the family as a source of care for the children still remains, in spite of all the assaults that have happened. The absence of biological parents has not completely deprived children of parental care, as is the case of the extended family. Mostly grandparents and, to an extent, other relatives fulfill this function. Assessing the impact of 3 generational families on the development of cognitive abilities of children, Moller established that children from 3 generational families performed better than children from nuclear families, even in the schooling system. This can be partly explained by the role that grandparents traditionally play in storytelling to young children. This might help in developing the children's attention spans and concentration abilities. 2, the family as the primary unit of socialization still continues. And here I quote Philomena Mwaura in the Lay Observatory. I think that's a Romano, that's an Italian publication. The extended family provided the individual with a personal and corporeal identity. One was assigned...
Recording in progress.
One was assigned to a particular community and was assigned distinct roles at various stages of life on the basis of age, gender, and social status. The cultural, social, and moral norms of the community that were applied within the extended family helped an individual to grow into a productive and respected member of the community. Those norms served as a blueprint for life. The extended family was and continues to be the first religious community to which an individual belongs. It was through parents, grandparents, and other members that one learned about religious and spiritual heritage. It was possibly where one learned about God, spirits, ancestors, and the afterlife. The extended family was and is also a means of mutual support. This principle that guides relationships is that of Ubuntu. You are because we are. or umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. A person is a person because of others. Also, the family plays a very important part in broken relationships. There is no African divorce which takes place before family negotiations have played a very important role, and many a divorce has been saved by the intervention of the family. Finally, or in conclusion, the African family has survived the political and economic onslaught, first of colonialism and secondly apartheid, because the cultural fabric had sufficient philosophical and religious basis to sustain resilience to foreign cultural incursions. The cultural resilience was also buttressed by the fact that although coming from a Western and therefore colonial perspective, Christianity promoted the sanctity of the family. South Africa is predominantly a Christian country, and Christianity came to a society that was already highly religious. There was thus a convergence of faiths. Physically, the family changed both shape and form under pressure from the political economy, but the spirit never changed as it continues to function as the building block in the social fabric. Hence, De Haas, an anthropologist, calls for the healing of the family. I thank you.